I think the president's role in foreign policy is very much derived out of a traditional sense that this is the rubric of, or within the rubric of executive power. Again, there is a commander-in-chief role. There's a sense that the president is the chief diplomat. And for the most part, through most of American history, Congress has gladly stayed aside, and they exercise their prerogatives in doing things like confirming cabinet officers, confirming ambassadors. And there are occasional funding disputes here and there. But for the most part, when it comes to foreign policy, the president, again, is in the driver's seat. And I think it's consistent with that Hamiltonian notion of energy in the executive, secrecy in particular. Secrecy is essential for the conduct of foreign policy. And I think even in instances where there is some disagreement on Capitol Hill, that generally Congress has tried to bend over backwards to concede to the president's wishes on foreign policy. It's not universal. And again, when you had a long engagement like we had in Vietnam, where things are clearly going south, I think Congress begins to see that maybe their trust in the executive hasn't been rewarded, and they look to try to reestablish themselves. But it's relatively rare that you find instances where the congressional role in foreign policy is dispositive.
Foreign policy is central to any president, and the irony is that not every president comes from a background of foreign policy. When we look at several of our previous presidents, Obama, even President George W. Bush, Clinton, Reagan, Carter, there isn't much of a foreign policy background among any of them, but yet they take the oath of office and they are immediately the most powerful foreign policy player on the planet. And that exists for multiple reasons. First, they govern the largest military force in the world, with a few exceptions. There are a couple of nations with larger armies. There is one nation with a larger nuclear arsenal, which comparatively means nothing. But the actual might and force and training of the American military is really unmatched. They command that. They are that individual is commander-in-chief. They also have diplomatic outposts in almost every country in the world, in some countries multiple outposts. They also govern an intelligence system, an intelligence network that is both domestic and foreign and communicates with other intelligence networks throughout the world. They are given each president is given a presidential daily briefing, which alerts them to the key threats and risks and trouble spots throughout the world and how those change on a daily basis. They also hold the nuclear codes. They could, without a check, launch a nuclear weapon anywhere at any time. There's legitimately no check on that power. The president wields unilaterally the ability to do whatever he wants in the short term with the military. And it's a terrifying military to anyone else in the world. And that gives him both that formal power as well as informal power to influence what happens in other countries, economically, socially, militarily, internationally. As nations relate to each other outside of the United States, the U.S. can still play a role in that because the power of the office and the powers behind the office are so mighty.
Presidents, because of their role as commander-in-chief, have been strongly supported through the Supreme Court in their role as commander-in-chief. There's something called the sole organ doctrine, which allows a president virtually, sort of unthwarted or untethered authority to determine the future of wars and to determine commitments to wars in terms of numbers of troops. The courts, interestingly, have sided. So while Congress sometimes tries to thwart the president's efforts abroad, the courts have sided repeatedly with presidents when it comes to war making. So it's a very interesting relationship. There are times when the courts can rule against a presidency. There are times that courts rule for a presidency. And what's perhaps most interesting about that is it harkens back to the founding era, where they wanted to create an executive branch where there would be energy in the executive. And it was times like this, in war making and in severe crises, where they really wanted a president who had unilateral authority to be able to make decisions on short notice. asking Congress to make a quick decision is really an impossible task for them. So the courts over time have sided with the president in their Supreme Court decisions.
Presidents negotiate treaties either through their staff or rarely these days on their own or one-on-one. But the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence services usually always play a role in dealing with treaties or other types of international agreements, even ones that are less formal than treaties. As they proceed, typically there is a constitutional mechanism by which those treaties are dealt with. Once the language has been agreed to, the treaty goes to the United States Senate, and the United States Senate has to approve it by a supermajority in order for it to be ratified, in order for it to take effect. The realities of treaty making, however, are quite different. Presidents have much more leeway in negotiating international agreements that are less formal, that are less binding than treaties are, but have, in many cases, just as much short-term effect. The difference between a treaty and an international agreement, or informal international agreements, is that the next president can simply get rid of it with the stroke of a pen. That sort of formal nullification doesn't exist with treaties, and in many ways, like the way the declaration of war has fallen away as a congressional tool, as a tool of the American government, so too has the formal treaty. And presidents are not just willing, but in many cases encouraged to do more of the informal work. Because while his successor might be able to get rid of it, his successor is probably not going to get rid of it if it's working.